I called around and I got some different rates of insurance to insure the contents of my office. And for the first 3 years that I was in the Bloomfield Centre, I paid a little bit more than $400 annually for office insurance. Well, Mr. Speaker, I was flabbergasted when last year I got my insurance renewal for my office, and the amount had doubled. It had gone from $420, $425 to $880, Mr. Speaker, in 1 year. Now, no claims not only in my office, but in the entire building, no break-ins. And I called my broker, and I essentially was told that I would not be able to do any better going anywhere else for insurance, that this was happening throughout all of the commercial sector, and that people were experiencing these kinds of doubling of their insurance premiums on their office space. Now, I've just received my notice for this year, and my office insurance has taken another jump, significant jump. It's gone from $880 last year to a little more than $1,200 this year. And again, Mr. Speaker, there's no reason for this. There's no claims. There's been no break-ins. And now, Mr. Speaker, the insurance industry can hardly say that these claims are connected to things like soft tissue injury and litigation. And, Mr. Speaker, we have heard of so many instances of people being unable to get their house insurance renewed because the shingles on their roof is 20 years old, or because the property beside them is being used for a particular reason, or, Mr. Speaker, because they haven't been able to provide a date for when the fuel tank was installed. My neighbor, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, has been told by her insurance company that they will not insure her house unless she moves her oil tank from where it is outside into the house, into the basement. Now, not so long ago, or quite a number of years ago, that's where the oil tank actually was in her basement. And she was told that she had to move it outside. Now she's being told she has to put it back at an extremely costly kind of impact to herself, Mr. Speaker. So, there's something happening in the insurance industry. And we know that the stock market has tanked, Mr. Speaker, for people who have invested in the stock market and have seen this as a place where they were going to be able to maintain very high rates of return on their investment. This has not come to pass. And, Mr. Speaker, it's hardly rocket science to be able to connect the dots and to understand that it's more than a coincidence that at a time when the rate of return in the stock market is so bad for large investors like the insurance industry, that they have gone looking for ways to maintain their profit margin and their returns to their shareholders. And, Mr. Speaker, we are a captive market. Homeowners, automobile drivers, in this province, like in other provinces, you're required to have insurance on your automobile if you're going to drive, if you're going to operate it and put it on our highways. And, Mr. Speaker, people have no option. And so we are at the mercy of this industry, an industry of of the largest corporations in the world, Mr. Speaker, and this is why the power of government needs to come into play to introduce some fairness and some balance to ensure that people who are at the mercy of the insurance industry are not gouged. But, Mr. Speaker, this government has neglected its obligation and its responsibilities to the people in Nova Scotia and has practically had to be dragged kicking and screaming to even a 9-month freeze, which essentially, Mr. Speaker, is a reprieve. And I would be the first person to say any measure that you can get out of this government that would give a reprieve is welcome. But nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, it's merely a reprieve until the election occurs. Mr. Speaker, I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. I went and I had a look at the Insurance Act. And it's quite a hefty piece of legislation, unlike this bill, which is anything but a hefty piece of legislation. The Insurance Act has extensive provisions, and I would imagine that the regulations that accompany the Act are probably even more complicated and extensive, never mind what the body of law surrounding the application of the Act and the regulations actually must be, Mr. Speaker. But as I understand this bill in fact will not prevent people whose insurance is coming up for renewal in this period of time from experiencing some increases in the costs to them for their insurance, and that there are any variety of ways in which their insurer will be able to continue to take money out of the pockets of Nova Scotians. There's nothing to prohibit an insurance company from no longer insuring an individual, but in fact requiring or moving them to facilities insurance, the insurer of last resort. And Mr. Speaker, this is a nightmare for people when they encounter that situation. Many people in my constituency had no idea there was such a beast as facilities insurance. This is becoming now common knowledge because it has become such a feature, an everyday feature of Nova Scotian families. There are people who are moved to facilities insurance who are being asked to pay more to get insurance than their vehicles are worth. And it seems that the decisions that precipitate this move to facilities insurance are quite arbitrary, Mr. Speaker, and they rest on some fairly discriminatory practices and ideas. So, for example, I've been told that a woman who has turned 80 has been moved to facilities insurance for no other reason than the fact that she has turned 80. She's received a notification that her insurer will no longer insure her. She has a clean driving record with the exception of one very minor fender bender about 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. And so these kinds of situations are being brought to our attention every day. Each member of this caucus is receiving many calls and emails, and people are actually dropping into my constituency office, Mr. Speaker, to talk about this. Now, another thing that is extremely troubling for me and for members of this caucus is the numbers of people who are driving without insurance because they simply are unable to afford the skyrocketing costs of insurance. I was listening to the member from Halifax Fairview the other day when he spoke, and I sort of thought to myself, you know, as he was talking, I remembered the day of the election in Halifax Fairview, the by-election. It was a very bad day. There was quite a snowstorm that day, and actually I was rear-ended by a woman who was on her way home from work that day, who I am sure, Mr. Speaker, she broke down and she cried when she got out of the car because she begged me not to put the claim through insurance. And I'm rather fearful that perhaps she was a single mother, it was her first day of employment, she was perhaps driving without insurance. And I thought to myself, you know, we need to do something about these costs, the high costs of automobile insurance. We have more and more people who are trying desperately to make ends meet on minimum wage incomes, and in some cases holding more than one job, Mr. Speaker, and sometimes some of these jobs require they have vehicles. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, some of the couriers, newspaper carriers, many jobs require automobiles now, especially in service sector industries. Yet salaries are very low quite often. They may be at minimum wage or slightly above. How in the world does anyone afford to cover the skyrocketing insurance rates? And Mr. Speaker, these rates are even worse for people if your vehicle is being used as part of your employment. We all know that we all pay additional money if you're using your vehicle to go back and forth to work every day, or if you're in fact using it as part of your employment. So, Mr. Speaker, these are all concerns and things that contribute to the crisis that exists out there in the community around this issue of insurance. Mr. Speaker, for years, it's been the practice of the insurance industry, certainly in this province, to base their rates on things like age and gender, make and model of automobile, and the age of the automobile. But it seems that a much more extreme kind of practice has crept into these discriminatory practices. I must say, Mr. Speaker, until the NDP Task Force on Insurance started to look at this issue, and the first interim report that came out with an examination of what existed in other provinces, I did not really understand that, in fact, there were systems of insurance in this country on which rates were not based on age, based on gender, based on the make and model of the vehicle and the age of the vehicle. I found that to be a new idea, and I thought, well, of course, it made a lot of sense that insurance rates really should be based on your driving record and not on these arbitrary ideas. And we've eliminated these forms of discrimination in so many other areas of daily life, Mr. Speaker. It only makes sense that we eliminate these discriminatory practices with respect to automobile insurance. This bill doesn't do that, Mr. Speaker, and I don't know what the government's plan is with respect to this, other than to stall for time and hope to be reelected in the meantime. Mr. Speaker, the NDP caucus, the Liberal caucus, have been making a great deal about the NDP campaign and not having gone the all-party committee route. And Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to my colleagues in the other party, opposition party. The all-party committee, as I understand it in Newfoundland, is a committee that has been working for quite a number of years without any conclusion or any action being taken to address the issues in that province. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that an all-party committee could in fact be both costly and ineffective in terms of taking any action, and can be nothing more than a stall tactic, when what's really required, Mr. Speaker, is a concerted effort to put as much pressure on the existing government as you can possibly bring to bear to force them to do something, which is why they're there and which is why we're here. I mean, this is our job. It's to hold the government to account for either the things that they are doing or the things that they're failing to do. It's to bring forward good ideas that they can take and implement and attempt to get some credit for, or not. And our campaign around insurance is nothing more than that, Mr. Speaker. As the long-term care campaign, it is a campaign that we undertook in a serious way because we recognize the incredible burden that the skyrocketing insurance rates were placing on families and on seniors, on taxi drivers and others who rely on a vehicle for their livelihood. And Mr. Speaker, it seemed that the Ham government were not taking that situation faced by so many people seriously enough, and it required a lot of pressure. And Mr. Speaker, you and I know there's nothing that puts more pressure on this government than mobilizing the public and mobilizing public opinion. And so that's why we're here, and that's what we've been doing. Mr. Speaker, the NDP caucus have issued 2 interim reports since we launched our task force. The first interim report was launched on the 24th of March, and it's a very good report, Mr. Speaker, as an interim report. I've used this report in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, with small groups in public settings. And what it does, Mr. Speaker, is it lays out, it gathers up, it collected the information on what is the situation in Nova Scotia, but also what has the situation been in other provinces, Mr. Speaker. And it outlined some of the options that we might have available to us. Options that would include a no-fault system, options that would include public auto insurance, options that would include more regulation in the current system. It looked at a hybrid system as they have in Quebec, and you know, it provided a lot of good data. And this particular interim report, Mr. Speaker, is still available through the NDP caucus, through our website, and through our constituency offices. The second report, Mr. Speaker, just was released earlier this week, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, as a matter of fact. And it contains a lot of information in terms of what the task force, the NDP task force on insurance, has been hearing from Nova Scotians. It has a number of examples in here. It really, I think, quantifies in some way the extent to the crisis that is occurring around the province for drivers who are being forced off the road or forced to be on the road without being being covered, being insured, and who have to make some fairly serious choices, financial choices in their own family situations. Mr. Speaker, well, you know yourself how long we've been at this issue, raising this issue. I believe it was back in January of 2002 that you, Mr. Speaker, and the member from Cape Breton Centre had written the URAB asking them to review the insurance rate increases. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's quite a long time ago, isn't it? It's way more than a year ago. We have yet to hear from the URAB. It took some prodding from this caucus, from yourself and from the member from Cape Breton Centre, to get the minister on board, the minister at that time from King South, to actually also approach the URAB to ask for an examination of the rates. You know, in Nova Scotia, it's quite a shock, really, Mr. Speaker, that in Nova Scotia, insurance companies don't have to. They don't apply requesting a rate increase at the URAB. What they do under the existing legislation is they just notify the URAB that in 10 days' time, there's going to be a rate increase. I believe that's the way it works, Mr. Speaker. They say, we intend to do this. And it's not really a question of the URAB saying to them, well, no, you can't do that. Although the URAB do have some particular powers if they're asked by government to hold hearings. Now, following that approach from this caucus, there were other things that we did. We wrote a letter to the Competition Bureau as a caucus outlining our concerns that there may be some collusion, because it seemed somewhat coincidental that so many of the insurers were all applying for rate increases of similar amounts at the same time, Mr. Speaker. And we've also participated in those hearings at the UARB in terms of intervening and bringing forward information. Mr. Speaker, we're not done with this issue by a long shot. The members of this caucus will continue to talk with people from our constituency and people who don't live in our constituency, who are sending us their ideas and their advice and some facts about the situations that they find themselves in around this issue. And in the not too distant future, Mr. Speaker, we will be bringing forward a final report with some clear recommendations, Mr. Speaker, on what it is that we think is required. Now, before I take my place, Mr. Speaker, the last things I want to speak to, Mr. Speaker, I want to speak to the issue of a consumer advocate, because the government appointed a consumer advocate. But, Mr. Speaker, this is no disrespect to the individual who they've appointed, George Jordan. I regret that he's no longer on CBC Radio. I quite enjoyed Mr. Jordan when he was there. He was terrific in that capacity. And not to say that I don't like the new person. She's terrific as well. I can't remember her name right, Carmen Clausen. But, Mr. Speaker, my idea of a consumer advocate and the minister's idea of a consumer advocate are two different things. And I think a consumer advocate really is a person who would be able to go to the URAB, for example, Mr. Speaker, and intervene on behalf of consumers, and in fact would be able to work with people from the public and assist them in intervening and representing themselves and their own points of view. That's what I think a consumer advocate is, and that's what a consumer advocate should be. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to have called the position that Mr. Jordan is in a consumer advocate position. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, there is no consumer advocate in Nova Scotia except in this caucus. This caucus is the consumer advocate, and we will continue to play that role. Mr. Speaker, we all know Ralph Nader was here, and I must say I regret that I was unable to get to any part of Ralph Nader's presentation because my nomination was that evening. But I did catch Ralph Nader on ATV with Steve Murphy, and of course he was very articulate and engaging, as Mr. Nader always is. And the thing that stuck with me, well, there are many things I can remember from what he said, but the thing that stuck with me the most was he said to Steve Murphy, "Would you want to go up against the insurance industry without a lawyer?" And I thought to myself, oh no, he's right. He's absolutely right. If this government or any group think that that's a solution to the problems in the rate structure in the insurance industry, then it's no solution. It would be totally abandoning people in Nova Scotia to not having the adequate representation that they require. And Mr. Speaker, I've heard other people say, if indeed there is some fraud, and Mr. Speaker, there's always some fraud, or there's always some misuse in most systems. Deal with that. You don't dismantle the whole system in order to get at a very small, minuscule problem in a system. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, we should never force consumers in an area so important as automobile insurance into a situation where they'll be unrepresented. The final point, Mr. Speaker, that I want to make is the question around what this government seems to be saying about public auto insurance. The Premier said today it's not their philosophy to have a driver-owned insurance scheme. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to get into those philosophical or those ideological debates. I think it's not helpful. What we need in Nova Scotia is something that's going to work for Nova Scotians, that's something that's going to address this issue in a way that will give Nova Scotians the lowest and the fairest insurance premiums that we can get. And we need to base it on evidence, Mr. Speaker. We need to look at the facts, and we need to learn from all of the information that's out there. And to date, that information, in fact, points to a publicly owned, driver-owned insurance plan. Mr. Speaker, I've been a member of the credit union movement in this province for many, many years. And it's no different than a credit union, Mr. Speaker. The credit union is owned by the members. The credit union either breaks even or it has a profit. If it has a profit, he pays dividends to its members, which are us, or it uses its profit to reinvest in the credit union to reduce the costs of services. And, Mr. Speaker, most of us heard, I think, the interview with the senior manager of the driver-owned insurance program in Manitoba on Information Morning earlier this week. And in Manitoba, the rates there have been frozen for a number of years. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, drivers in Manitoba got a cash rebate because because their driver-owned plan was so efficient, and they said, well, we don't need this money. We've made all of this money this year. Let's give it back to the people from whom this money has come, and that's the drivers in Manitoba. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that the government, in fact, need to rid itself of their ideological blinders. They need to look at the facts. They need to think about what is in the best interests of the driving public in this province, and they need to keep an open mind on this issue, Mr. Speaker. And believe me, they need to go one heck of a lot further in dealing with this crisis than Bill 45 takes us. And Mr. Chair, if they won't do it, then Mr. Speaker, we are prepared to do it. And we are prepared to tell the public in Nova Scotia that we are prepared to do it. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will take my seat. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I recognize the member from Cape Breton West, I just want to note that there are no cell phones to be used in the Assembly, and if someone is to use a cell phone, they should leave the Assembly. Thank you. I recognize the member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on a number of issues related to Bill number 45. The Insurance Act, which the government has introduced just days ago. Mr. Speaker, the general principle of the bill, as I understand, is not much more than an opportunity for the government to delay until January 2004 some very serious issues with regards to the escalating insurance rates in the province of Nova Scotia. I believe that's a little bit unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, given the fact that this issue has been before the Public Utilities and Review Board some months ago, and certainly the government had lots of opportunity to voice its opinion at that particular point in time, but chose not to. Why, Mr. Speaker? Only the government representatives would be in a position to say. Mr. Speaker, further, in the previous session of this legislature, last fall, the government rejected the suggestion that was made actually by the member from Cape Breton the Lakes on a suggestion for an all-party committee. And quite frankly, I thought that was a very worthwhile suggestion, because if we had started on that process back last fall, we certainly may have been considerably further ahead today in dealing with this issue of escalating insurance rates, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, do not only affect automobile insurance, it also affects home insurance, it affects insurance on many sporting and recreational vehicles, such as ATVs, boats, motorcycles. Irregardless, Mr. Speaker, the fact that insurance rates are escalating with such significant amounts and in such short a period of time is having an adverse impact, a very negative impact on the consumers in Nova Scotia. And I believe it would be safe to say, Mr. Speaker, that every Nova Scotian is impacted. Every Nova Scotian family is impacted in one way or the other. Mr. Speaker, I would like to focus on just a few. For example, take your typical young Nova Scotian family that have just bought a home. They have a mortgage. Well, Mr. Speaker, they are required not only to make the payments on their mortgage, but they are also required to carry insurance. as many would refer to as mortgage insurance. Now, they have one of a number of options. They can pay that as part of their mortgage payment, or they can go out and go to a bank, a financial institution, or an insurance company, for which in many cases they're attached or semi-attached, and they have to pay those insurance premiums. Mr. Speaker, now we're finding that they have to pay, in some cases, twice as much as they were paying last year. For example, Mr. Speaker, I will relate to a particular constituency family, who, by the way, Mr. Speaker, have given me the authorization to raise their names in the legislature. I've been given full approbation because their example underlines a representative population in this province that is very concerning because of the high numbers. Mr. Speaker, I speak of William and Sharon Herman from Broughton Road in my constituency. Just to give you an example of the impact of the cost to their family on insurance, both with their automobile and their home insurance, will demonstrate quite clearly that despite the government's best efforts with the $155, despite the government's best efforts with this referenced 10% tax cut, both those issues alone will not even cover half of the additional cost that this one family has to incur because of insurance increased payments, increased insurance payments. For example, last year, their automobile cost them in insurance $638. This year, they were advised that they have to pay $1,278. Their home insurance last year was $343. This year, they were advised that their premiums would go to $1,165. Mr. Speaker, we can see quite clearly for the average homeowner, for the average householder, for the average working Nova Scotian, these so-called tax breaks and rebates that the government is offering as election bait won't even come close to the additional costs on this one ticket item alone for this particular family. Mr. Speaker, this particular family, this couple, who are both in their mid-50s, have been driving since their teens, I am advised, have not had an accident, have not had any liquor violations, speeding violations, parking violations, anything of any concern that would impact on insurance. So the question asked is, why are these two good, honest, hard-working Nova Scotians being punished? And that's the only words that we can use. These individuals are being punished for doing a good job in conducting their personal affairs on the issue of automobile usage and home investment. Mr. Speaker, it clearly demonstrates how the average consumer in Nova Scotia is being gouged. Is being gouged, and the government to date has been trying to find some way of diffusing the situation. And I agree with the Minister of Environment and Labour. This is a complex issue, and it's not easily solved. It's not easily solved by philosophies. It's not easily solved by some individuals and groups of individuals claiming that they have the moral high ground on this issue, because as public policymakers, I believe there's enough blame to go around for everybody if you want to get right down to the details of it. Now, that doesn't discount the fact that the government and the Minister of Environment and Labour, who's responsible for this issue, they've sat quietly. They tried their level best to hope that the URAB would have the hearings. Those stakeholders that appeared would go through the usual process, vent their frustration, and the government would be off the hook, and maybe these unexpected premium surges would not be as negative as they would have thought it was. But it was so widespread and so impacting. But now we have, in the insurance industry in Nova Scotia, for the consumers, a crisis situation. And that's what it is, Mr. Speaker. It's a crisis. Many families are now forced to drop insurance on their homes. On their homes. They may be lucky enough not to have a mortgage, but they're not fortunate enough to be able to afford protection for their home from fire or flood or what have you, because they cannot afford the premiums, Mr. Speaker. They cannot, because their premiums have doubled. And in some cases, that can mean, for example, let's say, if you look at the Hermans and translate that into, let's say, do a comparative analysis and say, well, let's look at that if it were a grocery order. That's 5 grocery orders for the average family, 2 or 3 member family at $200 a week. That is a lot of money taken out of their daily budget, their weekly budget that they need for everyday living expenses. They cannot afford to continue to be gouged, Mr. Speaker. That's one aspect. Mr. Speaker, the government, even for a token gesture, they could have very easily said, okay, we agree. And they have said, yes, the escalating insurance rates are a problem. But at no point in time, Mr. Speaker, did they ever offer to give up that 3% tax, that hidden tax on insurance. Why, Mr. Speaker? Well, by the estimates within the Department of Environment and Labour will show the province of Nova Scotia will collect an extra $13.5 million this year alone on insurance premiums from home and automobile and all the other issues that are insured by Nova Scotians. They now collect, according to last year's estimates, $35 million a year. That's what this government collects in hidden tax. It would just amaze you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure you've had an opportunity to speak to some of your constituents. Ask them, how many of them actually know that the government has a hidden tax on insurance? Not too many. Not too many. It may be there in the fine print, but how many consumers go when they go and sign a loan or sign a banking document, sit down with a magnifying glass, and that's just about what you need, and read all the fine print? You'd be there for 2 hours, and you'd need a Philadelphia lawyer in some cases to interpret what they're saying. It's a question of trust. It's a question of faith. It's a question of hoping that this system, this capitalist system that we all want and believe to support, have enough checks and balances, Mr. Speaker, to protect the consumer. But we are at a crossroads. It's not protecting the consumer. So the government very easily could say, okay, well, look, we'll not just freeze that, but we'll forego that extra $13.5 million and give the consumer some relief. That was an opportunity. Maybe they couldn't afford it, maybe whatever. But, Mr. Speaker, these are some of the real genuine scenarios that could help families such as William and Sharon Herman from Broughton Road in my constituency. Mr. Speaker, I refer to a gentleman I spoke to a little earlier today, Mr. Ken Martin from Quinpool Road in Halifax. An excellent driving record. no speeding violations that I know of that would impact on a 50% rate increase that he's receiving this year. No, accidents. Nothing that he can himself identify that would justify a 50% tax increase. The Minister of Environment and Labour suggests, well, maybe one of the reasons they have lower insurance premiums in Western Canada is because the roads are flat and they're straight, so less chance for accidents. Well, let's go with that. Well, this particular individual lives in the capital city, in Metro, so he does very little driving, Mr. Speaker, compared to someone who would live in rural Nova Scotia and perhaps drive anywhere from 80 to 100 kilometers a day, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't make sense. And this particular piece of legislation is a delay tactic to get through the election. That's all it is. And I hear people, constituents in particular, say that more and more every day. And I don't always agree with the member for Halifax Needham, but I will agree with her on one thing. It's not about philosophy on this. You know, she is disagreeing with some of her own colleagues because they've said that it is a philosophical thing, and I'm sure that there are members in my caucus that wouldn't agree with every philosophical adage that I would have on this particular issue. But in principle, I think all members would agree that we have a real crisis for the consumers in Nova Scotia with insurance premiums. Well, Mr. Speaker, the member for Dartmouth North would like to think that the NDP are the only ones in Nova Scotia that are concerned about this. They're not. They're not. And we all have our own ways of dealing with things. Now, he has perhaps a showmanship way of doing things. That's fine. That's his right. That's what he was sent here to do. And if he's happy doing that, and his constituents are happy with that, that's fine. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's start focusing on some perspectives, Mr. Speaker. But before I do that, I'll give another example of a security officer who lives in the Preston area. Last year, his insurance premiums, his automobile insurance premiums, were a little more than $1,000, between $1,100 and $1,200. This year, Mr. Speaker, this gentleman, for no justifiable reason that he can understand, will be paying close to $3,000. You know? And I would think, and perhaps the representative for that area is doing lots on this issue, but we need to hear. We need to hear more than just a delay tactic, Mr. Speaker. There are a lot of people in certain communities across Nova Scotia, and particularly rural Nova Scotia, in areas of high unemployment. You know, if they were given an opportunity, you know, for some employment, they would have money. They would have money to pay their bills for insurance premiums on their home or their automobile. They would not be forced into dire straits. And I would submit, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of constituents in Tory-held ridings across this province that are asking themselves and scratching their head as to why we don't have a more aggressive policy forthcoming to deal with the problem now. Mr. Speaker, I asked the member for Timberley Prospect a little earlier what was his position on contingency rates. And Mr. Speaker, before I dwell into this aspect of the insurance problems here in Nova Scotia, I want to underline this is only one of a number of issues. And I raise it because it's what I'm hearing from my constituents. And I'm hearing it from business people, I'm hearing it from workers, I'm hearing it from the white-collar community, the blue-collar community. I'm hearing it right across the spectrum, Mr. Speaker. And one factor that's been raised, and all you have to do is pick up a telephone book. There are at least, in the Metro book alone, at least 8 to 10 pages of advertisements by legal firms indicating that if you have an accident, we'll represent you on a contingency basis. And Mr. Speaker, I've heard individuals say, well, look, I never thought about it. Well, you know, maybe it's a whiplash, maybe it's a back sprain, or maybe it could be a minor injury, maybe it's a major injury. Every case is different. I appreciate that. But we have to ask ourselves, you know, how much enticement is there for individuals to become involved in lawsuits that normally they would not? And it would be interesting to see, do a comparative analysis as to how much is being paid out in damages, whether it be soft tissue, whether it be more severe. Mr. Speaker, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in the insurance industry, so I can only conjecture on the best knowledge and information that I have. So I'm a little not as professional and fine-tuned as a learned professional like yourself in the profession. I do apologize, but I think speaking on layman's terms, I think it would be, it's a fair question to ask. Do a comparative analysis. How many lawsuits did we have before, you know, this advertising process started, you know, and became very prominent in Nova Scotia? I know there's one law firm in the community where my office is, my constituency office. They have a great big yellow van dressed up as a bulldog going around saying that they will fight for you. Essentially, the message is, call our number, we'll sink our teeth into the insurance companies, and we will get you money. That's the message. Well, Mr. Speaker, I hear the member from Pictou East call Darrell. Well, yes, the member the leader of the Socialist Party, the New Democratic Party, he does advertise. He does advertise in the local media for accident victims on a contingency basis. It's right there on page 393 of the Yellow Books. So, yes, and it goes to the point that I asked of the member for Timberley Prospect earlier today. Well, some members are saying, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Well, I'll table it, Mr. Speaker, so all members can judge for themselves. It's there. I asked the question about contingency fees, which is another aspect of this legal process. Mr. Speaker, should there be a cap on contingency fees? I don't know. I really don't know. But, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, they haven't clarified as to whether they would take that position or not. I've asked. And several members have said, we don't know. We don't know. Now, maybe there is a policy position. But, Mr. Speaker, let's compare the two processes, Manitoba, Nova Scotia. Now, if you look at Nova Scotia, there is a cap on soft tissue injury. Now, certain members of the House will argue, well, the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia has effectively put a cap on soft tissue injury by virtue of their decision. Well, the member for Dartmouth North is saying no, but the leader of the NDP party, as late as yesterday afternoon, said yes. So there has to be some consistency of logic in that party, because this is a very serious issue, Mr. Speaker. If we move with this so-called no-fault insurance, or this particular program, similar to the Manitoba experience, then they have to state quite clearly, whether they like it or not, the premise is there is a cap on soft tissue injury. And I would respectfully submit that the member for Dartmouth North should get on the same song sheet as the leader of the New Democratic Party, because you can't have two two individuals publicly at cross edges on the same policy issue. If we're going to go with that process, put all the cards on the table and say that's what it is. And if that's what the people of Nova Scotia want, well then fine, we'll support it. Mr. Speaker, you know, they've had lots of opportunity. They had lots of opportunity to outline and put some detail on their policy. But this, well, he's saying now it's coming. He's coming with a policy. His leader already says he has a policy. We have two members over there saying it's based on philosophy. We had the last speaker for the NDP saying it's not based on philosophy, it should be based on facts and figures, and I agree with her. I agree with her. So, Mr. Speaker, it demonstrates quite clearly how complex this issue is. Mr. Speaker, so if we're going to move with what the leader of the NDP was advocating, number one, I think it's fair to ask, does he support a cap on soft tissue injury? Because that's what that system is all about, in large measure. Because they say they can save money. And you save money because you pay less out. Now, let's not forget that there is an argument that the insurance companies are gouging the people of Nova Scotia. Now let's look at it in perspective. First of all, Mr. Speaker, many of the insurance companies that we have in Nova Scotia, for example, whether it be Fraser and Hoyt, whether it be Amherst Insurance, whether it be Robertson Insurance in Sydney River, or wherever, Co-op Insurance, many of these companies are small independent brokers. They are not the insurance companies. Many consumers, Mr. Speaker, do not realize that when you go into an insurance company, whether it be Amherst Insurance or Fraser and Hoyt or Robertson Insurance in Sydney River, A.J. Robertson Insurance, they are not the insurance company. They are just a broker. They are a contractor for the insurance company. In much the same vein as the hospital boards in Nova Scotia are an agent of the government. And their funding, you know, and the fees that they charge, whether they like it or not, in large measure can be dictated by the provincial government policy. For example, you take, in this year's budget, we saw almost around the same time as the government was debating the Department of Health budget, there were increased fees, parking fees, within certain jurisdictions, certain communities across the province. And they say, well, that's got nothing to do with the provincial budget. That's separate and local. But they had to raise their fees because of the limited dollars that came from the provincial level. So there is that cause and effect relationship. Same with the brokers. They are the contractor. They are the frontline agent that has to take it on the chin. And in many cases, they are at a loss to explain why these exorbitant increases. So we have to get past that for the consumers of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And delaying this until after an election well into the next year, with all the loopholes that can be accessed through this process, is not going to do the consumers of Nova Scotia any good. It will not, Mr. Speaker. So yes, it is a complex issue. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the arguments that, well, there's a lot of fraud. There's a lot of fraud in the insurance industry. Mr. Speaker, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I haven't seen any quantifiable evidence to show that that is a major factor. I haven't. And I would respectfully submit, if our NDP colleagues or the government members have that would show that that's a contributing factor, then they should provide it. Perhaps the government, the Minister of Environment Labour, should show a little leadership and go and demand this information from the insurance companies. Demand some substantive information, because we're receiving arguments from both sides, not only on the issue of fraud and how prevalent it is or lack thereof, but also on the soft tissue injury. Insurance companies are saying because of the growth in the soft tissue injury. So you would say, well, what's the cause and effect relationship? It's because more people find it easier to sue insurance companies because lawyers are running out there, as the NDP leader would say, ambulance chaser. Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, he's in the practice. He's in the practice. He's advertising as such. I don't know, because I'm not an expert in that, Mr. Speaker. What I do know is that many, many constituents I represent are being gouged, and they're being gouged unfairly. Mr. Speaker, many consumers, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, have found themselves in a position where they're forced to give up their insurance. They're forced to give up their insurance because, Mr. Speaker, since this government was elected, there are, I would say, slightly more than $500 million more in user fees being collected every year from the people of Nova Scotia. The cost of gasoline has gone up. I believe by admission from the Department of Finance officials that appeared before Public Accounts several weeks ago, they indicated that with the increased gasoline charges over the last winter, that the government will have collected an extra $12 million. $12 million. So there's $12 million plus a $13.5 million. That's $25.5 million more than they anticipated on collecting from the previous year. If anyone is guilty of gouging the consumers of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, it's this government. And that's just two issues. That's just two issues. And they're going to try and make people believe by introducing Bill 45. This is like a deferred maintenance account for the province of schools. The debt for individual families with 2 and 3 children, or even with one child, Mr. Speaker, the cost to these families, I would submit, we are looking at an extra I would guesstimate between $1,200 and $1,500 more a year in taxes, direct and hidden. Now, if you take that $155, which, by the way, the government, by its own admission, is borrowing $118 million more than it's taking in this year through taxes and transfers, which clearly shows it's not a balanced budget. But they're going to borrow money. They're going to put that on the debt. They're going to increase the debt. They're going to increase the interest payments on the debt in a short-term opportunity to dish out to half of Nova Scotians that they feel that they can influence at the ballot box. But let's take that $155 against the $1,500 that they're paying in additional cost between increased fuel tax for their automobiles, increased home heating oil, increased insurance fees. And you take that and you measure this so-called 10% provincial cut. It's not 10% of your total income. Let's not be misled here. It's not 10% against your total income. So what we have here, Mr. Speaker, for the average family, you may be talking another $100 to $100, but let's be generous and say $200. So they take $1,500 away from you, and they stick, and they say, we're going to give you $300 back. Mea culpa, thank us, put us back in power, and let's move on. So this bill is patently unfair in the way it's formatted. we should be dealing with this issue now. And all those Tory members across the floor should be standing up for their constituents, Mr. Speaker, not sitting there in silence, you know, not sitting there hoping that this issue will go away, not expecting the spin doctors in the Premier's office and over at P&P and the backroom boys in the Tory party who think that they can implement the Rumsfeld plan, control and manage the stakeholders. It's not going to work, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's just not going to work. And I kind of empathize with these Tory members because they must find it hard to go back to their constituencies every weekend and face the consumers in their riding. And some cabinet ministers, I want to identify them, that's not fair. But they're saying, no, that's no problem at all. They can go back and they can justify these massive increases. Why wouldn't the government say nothing? They're gouging the consumer. They're taking 3% for every dollar that's collected or paid in insurance premiums. The government is putting 3% of that in their pocket. Mr. Speaker, and they didn't even budget for that. This is a windfall. This is a windfall for the government because what they budgeted for was what they expected based on the gradual rate of inflation and so on and the premiums from previous years. So they're just sitting back. They're laughing all the way to the bank, this government. And then they have the audacity to think that $155 is going to get them an election. Wake up and smell the coffee because it isn't there. Mr. Speaker, when we have consumers that have, for example, in this case with the Hermans from Broughton Road, have a 400% increase in their insurance premiums for their home through no fault of their own. And the unfortunate part for this family, Mr. Speaker, they do not have a choice. They do not have a choice because they have a mortgage. Now, how many families in Metro have their homes where they have a mortgage? And these rates have almost doubled. If you go out to Halliburton Heights, or if you go out into Spryfield, you go to Harrietsfield, you go to some, or go over into Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, out Bedford Basin, you know, many Nova Scotians are being gouged, and they're being gouged, and further gouged, whereas the government will sit and say, well, we're going to try and buy some time by implementing Bill 45 and hope that things will calm down. The perception, the optics is we're doing something. Much the same, Mr. Speaker, as what the Premier did in the Red Room yesterday with Sunday shopping. Actually, I stood there. I couldn't believe it. That was a joke. It was an absolute joke to see that press conference unfold the way it did. After considerable questioning, he finally conceded that his press conference and the premise for doing what he did was based on polling. But he couldn't remember who did the polling. He couldn't remember the results of the polling. He couldn't remember how much the polling cost. He couldn't remember so many pieces of detail on that issue, Mr. Speaker. It was obvious that either he's totally disengaged from the reality of what's happening on public policy, or else, and yes, he's the same Premier who says he doesn't believe in polls, but Mr. Speaker, he's the same individual. He's the same individual that indicated that he would consult with Nova Scotians and he would be honest and open with Nova Scotians. Well, Mr. Speaker, if all you're going to do is to listen to a number of political operatives in the back room to try and implement this so-called Rumsfeld plan, quote, control your stakeholders, manage Nova Scotians, keep them calm, keep them collected, keep them so that they're not upset about any particular issue, let's get through the election, and let's go the avenue of least resistance. Well, that's not what people want. That's not the type of leadership people want. They wanted that premier who said in 1999 that he would consult with Nova Scotians, not someone who said one day that we will never put this on the issue on the order table until after the next election. And now, after it became quite evident when Danny Graham put this issue on the table and said, this is our party policy, this is what we want for Sunday shopping, well, all of a sudden, after a few weeks and the months started to go by, you know what happened? Reality set in. They got a reality check. The people of Nova Scotia said to the individual government members, you're going to lose ground on this. The people in Metro want Sunday shopping, and this is fertile ground for any political party because close to 50% of the seats are here. So what did the Premier have to do? Design some format, or have his operatives design a format to make it look like he was doing something, where at the same time he was doing nothing until after the fact. And this is the same as what's happening with this bill, 45, Mr. Speaker, this insurance bill. This is another delay tactic by the government. This is absence of leadership. That's all it is, Mr. Speaker. It's smoke and mirrors. And the people of Nova Scotia are becoming frustrated. They're becoming disillusioned. They really thought when they elected Premier Ham and the Conservative government, they would get some real leadership on tough issues. Well, a tough issue came up with the nurses, and what did they do? They came down with a 50-pound mallet and just about crushed every one of them, you know, taking their legal rights away from them through the collective bargaining process, even to the point of saying you're not even allowed to appeal to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. Well, this is not back in some kind of a military state, and the Minister of Health at that time and the Minister of Justice found that out pretty quick. You know, as much as the people of Nova Scotia may have agreed or disagreed with that issue, they were fair-minded, and they wanted all Nova Scotians to be treated fairly, which they were not. See? You know, that was evident. That was evident, and I feel it's fair to mention it because it's public forum. It was in the local media in New Glasgow. The Premier says he's fed up with protest. He's fed up with protest. And that's why he took legal action against an injured worker protesting in front of his constituency office. The same man, when he was on this side of the House, encouraged injured workers to go over and take over the Premier's office. Now, where's the rationale? Where's the rationale and the consistency of logic? Is that all open and honest, Mr. Speaker? Is that a measure of governmental integrity? I would submit not. Mr. Speaker, it's okay, really what the Premier is saying, it's okay to be a critic when it's in his favor, but it's not okay to be a critic when he's on the firing range, when people are questioning his motives and his policy initiatives. He doesn't want to be bothered, you know. He develops this amnesia about the facts and the figures. Well, Mr. Speaker, people won't go for that Marcus Welby approach anymore. Never mind the fantasy world. And the member for Preston, if he wants to help people who are, if he would like to engage in the debate, never mind the catcalls from the corner, rise and defend this particular piece of legislation. Because I've spoken, Mr. Speaker, with constituents from Preston, and they're not happy. They're not happy, Mr. Speaker, with this insurance issue. And the fact that many of them are being forced to give up insurance because of the lack of leadership by this government and the silence of that member. Mr. Speaker, I'll give you an example, that garbage issue that I raised last week. I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, how that impacts on the citizens of Preston and their ability to pay insurance. 2 years ago, the Department of Housing allotted money for that cleanup. And what happened after the budget was approved and things settled down, the House closed down? They canceled it. They took it out of the budget. They put it somewhere else. And do you know, Mr. Speaker, that was 2 years ago. Do you know what they did last year? This government? They budgeted that money in the Department of Transportation and Public Works for a cleanup. Somewhere in the vicinity of $60,000. Do you know what happened? After the budget was approved and the House closed down, they canceled it. Where was the member for Preston? Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, if you had good citizens from Preston out there engaged in that cleanup, they would have money to be able to pay their bills and pay their insurance premiums, the escalating premiums which that member is doing nothing about. See, you don't have to promise miracles, but you have to take a practical, pragmatic approach to helping everyday Nova Scotians. Don't be silent. Don't be absent. Don't run and hide when people are looking for leadership. They need you to stand up and protect their interest. When that honourable member was a member of City Council, yes, but when he got here provincially, he did nothing. And he proved it. And he proved it, Mr. Speaker. In other words, what he's saying is, when you become a provincial politician, you become a yes man for what you're told to do because he's done nothing since. That's really what that member is saying, and I will apologize for the Tory government as they gouge the consumers on insurance, as they gouge them with increased fuel cost and home heating cost. Between those two issues alone, collecting an extra $25.5 million in taxes and giving not even so much as $60,000 back to the community to help them feel good and do something constructive. Why not? Why not, Mr. Speaker? Maybe he doesn't have the influence with the minister that he should have, Mr. Speaker. That's just one community. Mr. Speaker, I was hoping, Mr. Speaker, the member for Colchester North would invite me back on this topic because that speaks to the very issue. If people don't have a source of income, how can they pay their insurance? And the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Justice yesterday chastised Nova Scotians who don't have a job, saying that they don't have dignity unless they have a job. Well, I would submit that the people from Preston, whether they have a job or they don't, they are people with dignity and pride and self-respect like anybody else in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of those people. And if those MLAs, particularly the member for Preston, doesn't want to do anything for his constituents, that's his business. And the people will speak when the ballot boxes are put before them. That's how it's tied into insurance. Automobile insurance, home insurance, and a lot of other things. What is being done for these good folks? Mr. Speaker, they want leadership. The member for Preston has lots of time to vindicate himself. Stand up. Even if you have to say, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, I'm sorry, I'm a Tory, and I have to toe the party line, but here's how I really feel. Stand up. I know that member can do it. He's done it when he was on City Council.
Please. I must bring the honourable member for Cape Breton West to order. He is focusing too much of his dissertation towards the honourable member for Preston, and I'd asked him to come back to the legislation before us, the Insurance Act. The Insurance Act. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is the principle of the bill. And how can people pay their insurance premiums if they don't have a job? They're looking for leadership. Whether that be the member for Preston, whether that be the member for the beautiful Colchester Musquodoboit Valley, or for Truro, or Cape Breton West, or where have you, Mr. Speaker, it's all interconnected. Mr. Speaker, if I focus too much on the member for Preston, it's because he invited it. He's the one that invited me to draw the correlation. Yes, Mr. Speaker, there is a vacuum when it comes to asking them to stand and go on the record as to how they really feel about this particular piece of legislation. I know it's not easy. It's not easy to stand up and defend your constituents when the government policy is saying, no, no, you don't do that. Mr. Speaker, if you took the total number of hours that the government members have to speak on this particular piece of legislation, we have over 30 hours of very constructive debate. We'd welcome listening to the government members voice their concerns. Maybe the NDP and the Liberals are all wrong on what they're saying. If they are, stand up and tell us. Don't just say that we're going to introduce a piece of legislation and say that we'll deal with it next year after the election, while consumers continually get gouged and people are continually given notices of 50 and 100 and 2 and 3, and in this case, Mr. Speaker, a 400% increase in their premiums for no justifiable reason. I think that commands leadership from this House and this government. Not a premier that says, oh, I really don't know, I can't remember, I'm not sure, I will get back to you on that, I will check it, and perhaps, maybe so, or, you know, we don't want that wishy-washy stuff. We want some leadership, Mr. Speaker. We don't want a premier that when he's asked a question, he doesn't have to be expected to answer every question, particularly on the insurance bill. But when he's asked, Mr. Speaker, and 87 times he defers to other ministers in his government, one that wasn't even in the House yesterday by his own admission. He went looking for the minister. He wanted to refer to it, and he wasn't even there. I mean, do you have to put beepers on these ministers to find out if they're there or they're not there? They should have like a little panel there with red lights and, you know, like present, not present, and so on. So when the premier stands up to refer a question to his minister, at least he'll know the minister is there. My golly, this is question period. The fundamental principles of responsible government. Well, yes, the member for Kings North says put a cowbell around their neck.
Order, please. Order, please. This debate is on the Insurance Act, and if the honourable member has concerns regarding question period and cowbells and things like that, perhaps he should take it to the Committee on Assembly Matters. But we should be discussing, and I think most speakers try to be fair and provide some leniency to members, but this dissertation from this particular member at this time is all over the roadmap, so to speak. So would the member come back to the Insurance Act? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The order, please. The Honourable member for Preston on point of order.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Cape Breton West challenged me to stand to rise on occasion to speak on insurance, but I want to rest his insurance and the insurance of my constituency press. I've been working hard on the off-road dumping problems in the press constituency, and I'll table for his information the recent correspondence that I sent to the ministers about this ongoing problem. I can honestly tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the so-called dissertations the honourable member from Cape Breton West has been asserting to, he should also alert the council for the area that it's not relevant what he said. There's been an ongoing problem there in self-insurance, and two of my constituents that the issue is being dealt with in a reasonable fashion.
Order, please. I find that the point of order that the honourable member brought forward is borderline point of order, but it is not a point of order. It doesn't meet the terms and conditions of a point of order. It's merely a disagreement between two honourable members. The honourable member for Cape Breton West has the floor, and he has approximately 7.5 minutes left.
Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to hear you say I was all over the roadmap because, do you know what, Mr. Speaker? Nova Scotians have been all over the roadmap looking for some leadership over here too, and they haven't found it. They haven't found it, Mr. Speaker, from that government or from the member for Preston. Mr. Speaker, they haven't found it. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Transportation Public Works said, oh, we're going to put all this extra money into roads this year. He forgot to tell us how much of that was federal. Okay, and the issue of roads, very, very impacting on this particular piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, because if we have half-decent roads to drive on, I'm sure our vehicles wouldn't be as beat up as they are, and I'm sure we would have better insurance rates because people wouldn't be going for fender benders on, icy roads or, unpleasant road conditions. These are all interconnected, Mr. Speaker. So I was glad to hear you say I was all over the road map, because we have some of the best roads in the province, and we have some of the worst. And we have the roads in rural Nova Scotia are getting worse. They're getting worse. Mr. Speaker, there was a bit of an adage in the general community in Cape Breton where I reside. They came up with the conclusion that the government was praying for snow for as long as it could, well into the spring and hopefully the summer, because what they could do is they could compact all this snow in the potholes and they wouldn't have potholes. And that would solve all the problems they have with roads. They could fill in the potholes with snow and that wouldn't cost them a cent. Well, Mr. Speaker, that isn't going to happen. Same as the insurance issue, Mr. Speaker. By ignoring it, it's not going to go away. The potholes are there, and the insurance problem for this government is not going to go away until they do something about it. Delaying it is not the solution, Mr. Speaker. So I was pleased to hear you say I went all over the road map of Nova Scotia, because, ironically, every one of these issues are connected. Mr. Speaker, you yourself know. Look at the recycling depots here in the province. What is this government doing? This government, every cent, every penny that went into the recycling programs of this province through the RRFB, the Resource Recovery Fund Board, every penny was to go to recycling. And what did this government do once it got elected? It gouged out 10%. Now it's collecting over $1.1 million a year and putting it into general coffers, Mr. Speaker. And what's happening with the Enviro depots? They are being forced to give up their insurance because they can't afford the high premiums, because this government is taking money that should go to them and putting it into the general coffers, and it is providing not enough assistance to make it a worthwhile operation. Mr. Speaker, that's how all these issues get interconnected. Now, with the paint recycling program, we're dealing with rather explosive and toxic issues here. And we know how dangerous it is if they store large quantities of paint in their Enviro depots. Mr. Speaker, all it would take is one fire. And you know what? Their whole life saving, their business, everything is wiped out. And Mr. Speaker, I was talking to a recycling agent just yesterday. Her insurance premiums increased by 100%. The cost of just handling the recycling program on paint alone is not enough. There is not enough revenue, Mr. Speaker, to cover the cost of that program. And what's the government doing? They're saying, tough luck. That's the responsibility of the RRF board. This politically appointed board, let them handle it. So the government sits in the closet, sucks $1 million a year away from the Enviro depot operators, which they should get, Mr. Speaker. That's why this province-wide protest. The best program in North America, Mr. Speaker, that was set up under a Liberal government, and yes, carried on after this administration took place. What did they do? They just couldn't stand success. They had to start siphoning off the revenues that were designed for that program, and then they started hitting them with these hidden increase fees, Mr. Speaker. By the way, Mr. Speaker, the government gets an extra 3%. You know, for every time the dollar goes up, the government gets an extra 3% of revenues. So why would they say anything? You know, the insurance premiums? You know, if your bill went from $100 to $200 a month, instead of collecting $3, you're collecting $6 as a government. See? That's why the government's doing nothing. But they should help these Enviro depots, these operators. I mean, Mr. Speaker, the cost to the environment, the cost to the economy. Look at HRM, look at CBRM, look at all these municipalities across the province. And what's the government doing? They're tone deaf. They're tone deaf to a very important issue. They're forcing these people to give up insurance, or in some cases, if they have mortgages, they're forcing them to shut down their operations. Is that the type of recycling program they want? Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I look forward to speaking on this bill on a future day, because the implications, it's just not auto insurance. It's just not home insurance. We're talking business insurance. We're talking for recreational insurance, you know, for boats, for ATVs. Mr. Speaker, what about for farm equipment? All these things, Mr. Speaker. You know, in the forest industry, they're paying increased insurance fees. And what's this government doing for the forest contractors? What's it doing for the farmers? What's it doing for the fishermen? Nothing. And I can go on and on and on, Mr. Speaker, but I think the point is well made, that this government is delaying because it's gouging. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable the Member for Hants East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to add to this debate, as debatable as that is. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that after 15 years in the classroom, and I don't know, nobody's claiming that I was an exceptional teacher, but I certainly have found it 5 years I haven't been able to educate the crowd on the opposite side of the house. So that maybe before my time is done here, I can give everybody a star before they leave the House of Assembly. Mr. Speaker, the issue of auto insurance is a serious one. And I have to say that Nova Scotians have felt the brunt of anybody who wants to bump them or gouge them for a few years now. And they have received no help from this government. We've seen it in terms of seniors in long-term care facilities. We see it with auto insurance. It's certainly occurring with home insurance and other insurance programs. And it occurs in particular through the winter with home heating fuel. We pay through the nose at the gas pumps, and Nova Scotians have not had a break since this government has come into power. And that only identifies those fees that we pay that are the most noticeable. It doesn't identify the fees that we sometimes don't pay enough attention to, like when we register our vehicles. I mentioned the other day about the Milford Lions Club, whose license for bingo had gone from $50 2 years ago to $150 a year ago to $300 this year, and to expect a community volunteer organization to pay that type of fee because they contribute to their community in a big way. And you know, Mr. Speaker, for those times that I can't get any help from community services, like if in trying to get glasses for someone, I go to the Lions Club. And matter of fact, they've been able to help when the government has been unwilling to help. And how does the government repay them? By jacking up the fee they would have to pay to run their bingos. I mean, we even had an incident in Shubenacadie where a volunteer firefighter was injured and had to pay the $500 ambulance fee when the ambulance took him to the hospital, which, you know, Mr. Speaker, these are volunteers, and that seems a bit much to ask volunteers to do. But I want to say, in terms of this act, the Insurance Act, Mr. Speaker, it's really disappointing, although predictable. I mean, we certainly would expect, because we know we're going down this road to an election. We've had almost 5 years of consistent inconsistency with this government, and we can well imagine that when this issue was raised, and it was raised by the NDP caucus, as much as anybody else in this House wants to claim that they were on the forefront of this, baloney, Mr. Speaker. That's what I say to them. If they want to pay attention to the chronology and the Hansard record in this House, they'll find who uttered the first words on this issue, and it was the New Democratic Caucus. And I would say that it's been a long, hard fight, and actually because it's now at the forefront of the public's mind, because it's an issue that resonates with the public, that's why the government and the Liberal caucus have started to jump on this. Finally coming out of their slumber, thinking we better do something to head off the New Democrats going down this road to election. Well, I guess if I want to take advice from the honourable member from Cape Breton West about talking about the issue, I can be all over the map, Mr. Speaker, for sure. Mr. Speaker, bad enough, actually, bad enough that this piece of legislation is so bad, but for the Minister of Environment and Labour, who is responsible for skyrocketing insurance rates, for him to stand in this House and try to convince members on all sides of this House that this bill actually is going to do something to bring us lower insurance rates is preposterous. Because if the minister would read his bill, and I'm not sure how it is that ministers get their legislation, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure that on the way out of the office in the morning, if the deputy or some member of the minister's staff hands him the bill and says, deliver this in the House today, and he says, yes, I'll do that, but he doesn't take the time to read it, because that would be the indication that I get when I look at this piece of legislation, and then I listen to the minister talk about the legislation in question period, when he tries to give our caucus answers to questions we raise on this legislation. Because the minister seems to be hanging his hat on his ability to draft regulations. Well, this is the same old song and dance we hear quite often on legislation. What we don't see in the bill, what they won't put in black and white, they'll say, oh, we're going to take care of that in regulation. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's an explanatory note with this bill, and explanatory notes are common. They come with lots of pieces of legislation and trying to explain what particular clauses in the legislation mean. Well, Mr. Speaker, this explanatory note for Clause 2, it says, authorizes the Governor and Council to make regulations prescribing grounds for which an automobile insurer cannot refuse to issue, refuse to renew, or terminate insurance, or refuse to provide or continue any coverage or endorsement. Well, Mr. Speaker, that quite clearly indicates what the powers of the Governor and Council are in terms of drafting regulations in this bill. They can draft regulation so that the insurers cannot refuse to give someone insurance. That's it. They can't refuse them. That doesn't say they have to give them a lower rate. That doesn't mean they have to find them the lowest rate. That doesn't mean anything except they have to sell them insurance, some insurance. But there's no guarantee that that person, when they get that insurance, will have to pay through the nose for it. Now, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't change anything. The present situation in this province is simply that people are being moved from one category to a higher category to a higher category for whatever reason the insurance industry deems fit. Doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with your driving record, and heaven help you if it does. But it could be because of your age, it could be because of the age of your vehicle. You may not have even had an accident for years or ever had one, but you're probably going to pay more. And this bill does not stop that, although the minister brings it in as a freeze on insurance rates. Well, it doesn't stop those increases that were recently applied for by the insurance industry to the Utility and Review Board. Because those applications went in prior to this legislation coming into effect, which is May 1st, those increases will still happen. And people are getting their notices now, Mr. Speaker, to tell them that they're going to have an increase in their insurance, even after this legislation. So along with the increases that the industry has already applied for, then people will find themselves pushed into a different category, which would mean you're allowed to be bumped up to a category that would impact you in a way that you would have to pay higher insurance. There's nothing to stop the insurance industry from doing that to you, for whatever reason they deem fit. So, Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation is not a freeze. Matter of fact, I don't even know what you would call this piece of legislation. This piece of legislation would be called, I hope we buffalo the people of Nova Scotia and get reelected. That's what this bill should be called, because that's the intent of this bill. A piece of legislation that's supposed to impact a freeze from May 1st to January 1st. Well, I'm not a betting man, Mr. Speaker. I'm not a betting man, Mr. Speaker, but I'd be willing to bet we're going to have an election before January 1st. Yeah, well, I think the members opposite are willing to give me good odds on that, so Mr. Speaker, why is it that the government does not feel compelled to do something really appropriate to this situation? Why is it that the government doesn't feel compelled to actually either bring in legislation that will roll back rates or bring in a publicly owned system? Now, we seem to have picked up some heat from members of the third party, and now and then from members on the government side, and certainly the Minister of Environment and Labour has been hammering us pretty hard on this idea of public auto insurance. And I want to tell the Speaker that this is not rocket science, Mr. Speaker, that this is something that's been tried and found successful in 3 other jurisdictions. And actually, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I was a little bit, I think, thrown by comments by the honourable member for Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley the other night when this debate was part of our late debate series, and the honourable member for Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley spoke on the issue of auto insurance and seemed to get somewhat derailed on that issue, and for some reason targeted some of his comments to me, which I'm not sure why, but one of the things that the member for Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley raised was the fact that this was socialist. To have a publicly owned system was socialist. Well, I want to tell the member for Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley and all members on the government side that healthcare in this country is socialist. Paying for education the way we do is socialist. The supply management system that protects farmers who produce milk, chicken, or eggs is socialist. So, I want to say...
We seem to have some animal-like sounds coming out of the chamber somewhere. I'm not sure if there's a cat on the loose or what the problem might be, but I would surely hope it wouldn't be an honourable member making such sounds. But anyway, the member for Hants East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr.
Just
Speaker.
a distraction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that. Considering the pussyfooting around that's gone on this issue from the members opposite, it wouldn't surprise me a bit. So, Mr. Speaker, why is it that the government has been so willing to abdicate its responsibility to the voters? Why is it that it is unwilling to wear the mantle that says we're going to stand up for you and we're going to fight the good fight to ensure that you're not gouged day in and day out by somebody. Well, I don't have an answer for that. I can pose the question, but I don't have an answer because governments are elected. Governments are elected, Mr. Speaker, to represent everybody. Governments are elected to represent Tories, Liberals, New Democrats, whatever political stripe. When you form a government, you represent all the people. And I can't understand why this government has been so willing to let the people who they know supported them, even if they took just those people, to let them bear the brunt of the way they're being abused by the insurance industry in this country. Now, could it be that this government has collected $7 million in extra taxes because of the increase in insurance rates? Maybe that's the incentive that the government has. Now, what's the government plan on doing with that money? Well, good question. Is that part of the $68 million that the government is going to use to buy votes in this upcoming election? Perhaps that's where that $7 million went, Mr. Speaker. I'm imputing motive, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I remember when the Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour introduced this bill, and I took a few notes. And actually, when that honourable member stands to speak, I quite often take notes. I think his years in the House deems him worthy that I should pay attention to what he says, and I try to do that. And actually, I do that for another reason, Mr. Speaker, because he's a constituent of mine. And it's important to me that I listen to my constituents, and if I can do anything to help him, I'm more than happy to do that. And if I can talk him into moving away from this piece of legislation, I think that will help the Minister of Environment and Labour. He moved in after the elections, but he did assure me that I could have a sign location there. So, didn't say which sign, right? Mr. Speaker, the minister said that this was a global issue, and he said that they had kept an open door to the industry to hear their concerns. And I worry, Mr. Speaker, when I hear the minister say something like, we kept an open door to the industry to hear their concerns, because he didn't mention about any open door to Nova Scotians to hear their concerns. He didn't mention that people who have come to realize that they're being gouged and this government is not standing up for them has not resonated with the government. But the industry's concerns have resonated with the government, and that's my worry, that come January 1st, that the industry will be the one who will come out of this in the best shape, and Nova Scotians are still going to be paying through the nose. Now, the minister has said it's difficult to carry on a debate while looking over our shoulder. Well, I say to the minister, look ahead. Don't be looking over your shoulder. Look at what other people have done in other jurisdictions to help alleviate this problem, to help improve the lives of the people they represent, and actually help them in more ways than just insurance, because in Manitoba, they've actually been able to turn some of the money back onto the roads, which as the minister would think is flat. And if that's the case, then there's no downhill in this policy. So I want the minister to think a little bit about what this bill is actually going to do for Nova Scotians, and he should be thinking in political terms about what it's going to do to this Tory government, because Nova Scotians are not going to be snookered on this, Mr. Speaker. They are really concerned, and if you're between 16 and 61 or 81, you're going to be impacted by insurance rates in this province, and that is going to take in a large number of voters in this province that I think are looking for some answer, and they are wondering why their government has abandoned them on this, because this has occurred, I think, by stealth. The insurance industry has done this incrementally over time, and I think that the government has been aware of that, and we've tried to make the government aware. People have called our offices to let us know this for some time and wondered what was possible to be done. Back as far as 2001, December, the NDP caucus had asked the Utility and Review Board, asked the government to send this to the Utility and Review Board, and actually it took urging by us to get that accomplished. There is a litany of a timeline since then of input by our caucus to try to get this matter on the agenda so that the government could deal with it. And it's only been recently that the government has actually felt the pressure of that. And although I think they're trying to make the case that they're so concerned about the people of Nova Scotia that they're willing to hang them for a few months with no relief, has not been any comfort. That people that I've talked to in my constituency are really worried because they know that the present increases that have occurred, that have been applied for at the Utility and Review Board, they're going to have to pay, and that this bill is not going to bring down those rates. And actually, the minister's bill doesn't say anything about bringing down rates. So the only thing that I can see that the minister is going to do is ensure that people can get insurance, but at what cost? And there's nothing in this legislation that would protect them in that regard. The insurance companies have a mandate. They have to serve their shareholders, Mr. Speaker. They have to try to make a profit and give a return to the shareholder. It's been, I think, pretty widely identified that there's really only two ways for insurance companies to make money. One would have to be on their premiums, and the other one would be on investments. So the companies would be willing to take a loss on their premium if they can make it back up in their investment. But if they can't, if their investments go south, then we're going to pay through the premiums, and that's what's happening. The stock market has taken a dive since March of 2001, and the insurance industry has taken a bath in that stock market. And it's because of that premiums have shot up. And I want to say how great it must be to be an insurance company. That whatever losses you take as a hit on the stock market, that you can just reach out and say to people, here, you got to increase your premium so that I can get my money back. And some people would say, well, let the private sector run this and let the public sector stay away from it. Well, that would probably make some sense, Mr. Speaker, in the real world. But the world that we live in is a world where the government requires you to have automobile insurance. The government says you must have coverage. And because the government says you must have coverage, then the government has a responsibility to protect drivers in this province from being gouged by the industry, Mr. Speaker. And that is what brought forth public automobile insurance in British Columbia, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Now, not all of those systems are exactly the same. No fault in Manitoba, a combination of tort and no fault in Saskatchewan, and the tort system alone in British Columbia. The people there all decided which system they thought would be the appropriate system for them and have gone with that. But those three provinces represent the lowest premiums in the country. I heard the members from the Liberal Party actually heard this morning, I think it was in a resolution, the honourable member from Cape Breton Nova, I think he raised the issue of $300 million to set up the automobile insurance in Manitoba. 350 million, my colleague from Dartmouth North. So anyway, I'll leave the numbers to them. I won't argue with the numbers, but I want to tell members opposite that to set up the corporation did borrow money, or the government lent money to the corporation to set it up, which it paid back in a year. I'll thank the Minister of Environment and Labor for that, and I'll get back to him on that. Yeah. But what I do want to tell the minister is they're not losing money. It's not for profit, and the people in those three provinces are well served in whatever way they set it up. And because they don't have to make a profit, they need to cover their costs, they're able to deliver much better insurance rates to the public, which is really all the public is asking. If the government is demanding that they have automobile insurance, then the government has a responsibility to see that they can get that at a reasonable price. That is not rocket science. And especially for this government, when you consider they wouldn't have to do this for the first time, that there is a model, or there's three models that they can look at. They can choose the one that they think would be the most appropriate, and if they need to tweak it a little bit to make it fit in Nova Scotia, fine, because that's exactly what those provinces did, Mr. Speaker, to find something that was appropriate for the people there to live with. Now, the honourable member from Dartmouth Cole Harbour, the leader of this party, I was looking at his comments when he spoke on this issue, and the issue for profit is a serious one. That when Henry Ford had decided that he made enough money in the automobile industry, he had the intention of selling his automobiles at a cheaper price so more people could have them. That's right. He felt that he had gotten what he needed out of this industry. On reflection, he felt that if he could improve the lives of people, that this would be something he would feel very good about. Hear, hear. So that was what he set out to do. He set out to sell automobiles cheaper so more people could get them. And actually, he wanted to also allow his workers to share in that benefit. So, Mr. Speaker, what happened was he was sued. He was sued by the shareholders of the company, and he was found that they were right. The Supreme Court agreed with them, and Henry Ford was not allowed to sell automobiles cheaper or to take care of his employees in a way that he deemed was necessary, because that took dividends or profits or money away from the shareholders, and the court deemed that the sole purpose of the corporation was to make money for the shareholders, was to make a profit. And he had no business interfering in that, and actually they referred to him as a menace. So, Mr. Speaker, that, I think in a nutshell, tells us what we're up against when we talk about companies that have offices in Amsterdam or in London or wherever, and are they concerned about the impacts of drivers in little old Nova Scotia? I would say no. They're not concerned, and if that means pushing you to a higher level or of cost, or the fact that you can't afford to insure your vehicle and you drive without insurance, that is of no concern to them, Mr. Speaker. I see we're getting to the hour of... Okay. I see we're getting to the hour of interruption, and I'm not going to be interrupted, Mr. Speaker, so I'll keep going. So, Mr. Speaker, by tomorrow or Monday, sometime soon, this debate is going to end. And since this government has a majority, then this bill is going to pass. And the question is, what will be the benefit to insurance buying Nova Scotians? Absolutely none. It'll be the frustration of recognizing that somebody could have done something, somebody should have done something, and they didn't. And the members of the government side are going to have to knock on doors at some time soon and try to explain to Nova Scotians why it is that they have done nothing to reduce the impact of automobile insurers on them. Why it is that they've seen 100% increases and sometimes more on them and their families. Why the auto insurance industry has been able to make young drivers in the family, somebody who just got a license, to identify them as the primary driver, even though it hasn't been identified by the family. Why is it that the insurance companies have that much latitude to try to squeeze the most dollars out of any one family? And that's unfair. You should be able to buy the service you want at a reasonable rate. And in particular, because this service is demanded for by the government. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat and for the hour of interruption.